We're going to be looking at how to simplify radicals using the product rule. Product means when you multiply whatever's underneath the radical, you take that and you separate it, or it's like factors of a number, and you take that and separate them. One has to be the greatest perfect square value to take out. So for the first example, we have the square root of 54. What we're looking for is we're looking for two factors that multiply to get you 54, one being the greatest perfect square value. A perfect square value is like 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, and so on. So it's like two numbers that multiply together to get that same number. So in this case, I have the square root of 54. My two numbers are going to be 9 times the square root of 6. So square root of 9 times the square root of 6. When I do this, I want to make sure that this is the greatest perfect square value. And I would have it be the square root of 9 is 3 times the square root of 6. Now this works because if you look at your radical underneath, like that number that's underneath, that 6, it can't be simplified anymore because you can't take out another greatest perfect square value. So for example 2, I have the square root of 12. Well, I have to think about what is a factor of 12, 1 being the greatest perfect square value. And that's going to be the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. If I take the square root of 4, I can simplify that to 2. That's going to go on outside of the radical. And then times the square root of 3. If I look at the square root of 3, I notice that that cannot be simplified anymore, so I'm just going to leave it. Now, for example 3, I have the square root of 200. With that one, what I'm looking at is I need the greatest perfect square value. I'm going to show you two ways just in case maybe you don't take out the greatest perfect square value, and I'm going to show you the right way to do it. So if you were to do it the right way and you took out the greatest perfect square value, what I would do is I would think, okay, 2 times 100 is 200. 100 is the greatest perfect square value. Square root of 100 is 10 times the square root of 2. That would be my final answer. Now, let's say that I know that, let's say I decide to choose 25. So I have the square root of 25, and I think about, okay, 25 times what is going to give me 200, and I say that's going to be 8. Well, I know the square root of 25 is 5 times the square root of 8. The only problem is that I can simplify 8 even further. So that's why that 25 was not the greatest perfect square value. So what I would do is I would bring down that 5, multiply it by the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. 4 is the greatest perfect square value for 8. Well, I know the square root of 4 is 2. So I have 5 times 2 times the square root of 2. Well, I know that 5 times 2 is 10. And look, you still get the same answer, but that one was a lot quicker if I took out the greatest perfect square value. Now with the square root of 35, for example 4, you cannot simplify this any further. So the square root of 35 would be the answer. So if you think about it, factors of 35, 1 and 35 is factors, and 7 and 5 are factors, and none of them are greatest perfect square values. So that's why the square root of 35 would be the answer. Now we're going to take this a step further. So if I look at 3 times the square root of 8, I know this is always multiplication if it's right next to that square root value. And I know that 3 times factors of 8, 1 being the greatest perfect square value, would be 4 times the square root of 2. I know that 3 times square root of 4 times is 2. So 3 times 2 times the square root of 2. Well, I know that 3 times 2 is 6, and the square root of 2, so that would be my final answer. My last example, example 6, I have 5 times the square root of 40. So I have 5 times, now I know that the 4 is the greatest perfect square value. So I have 5 times the square root of 4, so I got 5 times 2 times the square root of 10. I know that 10 is the correct, like 10, it cannot be simplified anymore, so I took out the greatest perfect square value. I got 5 times 2, which would be 10, times the square root of 10. So that would be my final answer.